I hope that this session is informative to you. I have about 20 minutes to finish it, and then I hope to take some questions. Um, so yeah, today's topic is on buprenorphine maintenance treatment. So the overview will be, we'll look at some contexts, then we'll look at the pharmacology, the treatment process, clinical pearls, and then some practical considerations, which I hope you guys can add on to for all of our knowledge. So the context of using buprenorphine, one of the really important aspects is harm reduction, because we're going from a person using something illicit, something possibly injectable, short acting of unknown dose and unknown purity, from an unknown dealer in an unknown situation, which is secretive, compromising, difficult to carry on with their daily activities because they're looking for their next hit. Something that's incredibly uncontrolled, sometimes can be mixed in with other things, and impairing, right? And we're taking that entire context and moving it to medication, which is of known purity from a known person. It's a much more dignified way of living. It's licit, it's oral, it's long acting, oral or sublingual. It's long acting, it's a definite dose. And also, in general, it's a safe situation. You feel supported. It's reassuring to be in treatment. You also have opportunities to engage with other, practitioners. Maybe if you have um, hepatitis C, for example, then you can get links to other treatments as well. It's a more controlled situation, and it is extremely empowering. So although a lot of people used to argue that we're basically just substituting one opioid for another, we do know that these two opioids, the illicit one and buprenorphine, differ greatly in the kind of context that we use it in. Buprenorphine is a partial mu-agonist, and it has extremely good affinity for mu-receptor. It very slowly dissociates from the mu-receptor. It has a slow onset of action, a delayed peak, and a long half-life. And all of these factors actually, make it suitable for maintenance treatment. And we'll see why. Buprenorphine is poorly absorbed orally, modestly absorbed sublingually, and rapidly absorbed intranasal or parenteral, which means that it actually does have abuse liability if taken in the routes which are not prescribed. But we often prescribe it sublingually. Naloxone is a short acting opioid antagonist which is frequently combined with buprenorphine. It is poorly absorbed sublingually, so it doesn't matter if we take it in combination with buprenorphine in the prescribed form, which is sublingual, but it is rapidly absorbed parenterally and intranasally. So if someone were to consider diverting buprenorphine by, taking it, crushing it, taking it intranasally or parenterally, then naloxone would get activated and then perhaps reduce that risk. So why is this important? Because it slowly dissociates from the mu receptor, there is a milder but more protracted withdrawal. So the withdrawal isn't as harrowing as perhaps the withdrawal of heroin, right? It has a slow onset of action, so there is no benefit of hurried repeat, and therefore the person would not continuously pop this pill as opposed to what usually happens with illicit drugs. It has a delayed peak of 90 to 120 minutes, and it has a long half life of about 37 hours, which facilitates once a day dosing. And that, for a person who has been using illicit substances, can make a world of a difference, because now they just have to focus on this one medication and then they can carry on with the other responsibilities of life. The treatment process is known as opioid agonist treatment, and opioid agonist maintenance therapy is the most effective treatment option for all patients with opioid use disorder. There might be problems with regulations, prescriber comfort, and patient preference, but otherwise, the evidence for OAT is unequivocal, especially in injecting drug users. So, what we do first is actually select our patient, make sure that they do, in fact, have physical dependence to the agent. They also should be able to consent to it, right? And we also need to look at other feasibility and practical things like whether they can afford it, whether they can continue it long term, whether there's a center close to where they are. When we do our induction, the first thing we actually look at is, are they already in withdrawal? Because if they aren't already in withdrawal, then by giving them a partial agonist, partial agonist will displace the agonist and therefore the person will experience something known as precipitated withdrawal. And that is very uncomfortable. So obviously, we want to make sure that the person is already in withdrawal. And then we want to look at what dose do we need to actually control those withdrawal symptoms. After the induction, we need to actually look at maintenance. And maintenance is basically because we want to make sure that they do not continue to experience craving. And hopefully, we achieve a dose called blocking dose, which can maybe prevent all further illicit drug use. Eventually, the last stage is termination or discontinuation. And the important thing to note here is that this is a very, very collaborative effort throughout the maintenance and termination parts of this therapy. It's important that they feel supported throughout the process. It is their decision to actually terminate if they've attained all of the functional recovery goals they had decided beforehand. And we need to also make sure that we educate them beforehand about the risk of reverse tolerance and overdose should they, lapse or relapse in the future. So, prerequisites for a precipitated withdrawal scenario, something that I mentioned earlier, if you induce or start buprenorphine in an individual who is not currently in withdrawal, but are dependent on opioids, then what might happen is that buprenorphine, because of its high affinity to the mu-opioid receptor, can displace the agonist and then therefore cause withdrawal. Because a partial agonist in the presence of an agonist may act as an antagonist, right? So, induction should be done preferably when some withdrawal symptoms have started. The usual starting dose is 2 milligrams. Usually, for heroin, the day one dose may go up to 6 to 8 milligram, but there is very little benefit post that. How do we then decide what is the adequate dose? So, when we're trying to give buprenorphine to someone, we probably have three milestones in mind. The first milestone is to abate the withdrawal symptoms. The second milestone is to help with craving. And the third milestone is to achieve blocking effect. So, almost all objective symptoms of withdrawal will improve with 8 to 10 milligrams buprenorphine, is what some of the research says. And this again, this dose is actually for heroin. So I'm not talking about pharmaceutical opioids, which might be much weaker agonists, right? So your withdrawal is taken care of. The next thing that we have to actually look at is craving. But before that, if your withdrawal symptoms seem to persist, even though you are giving quite high doses of buprenorphine and you expected that the withdrawal would improve, then you should maybe look at whether the administration of buprenorphine is actually taking place sublingually, or if there is some inadvertent oral administration that's going on. And also looking at adherence to treatment, because of course if the person is unable to comply with treatment, that either speaks of their tolerability to it or the suitability of it in the first place, right? In maintenance, we actually want to improve their functioning, their employment, their adjustment, their other addictive behaviors, and physical health. It's important that we then look at craving, like I said, the second milestone. So we can assess craving by actually asking about craving. We can use visual analog scores. We can use hypothetical scenarios, such as if I were to leave this room and if I were to place such and such substance here, how likely out of 10 would you be to use it? Asking about craving need not necessarily increase craving. So, in fact, asking about craving might make it easier for them to report it. They might feel more understood and they might feel that, okay, it is normal to experience craving from time to time. This might actually improve our alliance and also their self report at later stages during the maintenance treatment. So for heroin, the blocking doses can be 16 milligrams and above, and this actually achieves blocking doses. So buprenorphine goes and captures all of the mu-opioid receptors such that they don't feel like taking other opioids. And in a hypothetical situation, if they were to take another another agonist, it would not work as well. And that's what we mean by blocking dose. In follow-ups, it's important to check for craving. The other things to consider are other life situations, pain, recent medical illness, surgical complications. All of these can increase or decrease the need for buprenorphine during the maintenance phase. And it's important to do this back and forth with the patient. Educate about the risks of combining it with alcohol and benzodiazepines. because buprenorphine is also a CNS depressant and they can have cumulative effects. While a patient is on maintenance, it's important to ask for constipation because this is a near universal experience. It is because of increased water reabsorption and decreased motility. It's important to always treat constipation a little bit differently than we would otherwise. Opioid induced constipation may not improve with fiber supplementation. It can actually worsen the pain associated with constipation. Instead, there is more evidence for osmotic laxatives and irritative laxatives. In about 50% of patients, on all forms of opioids, patients can experience sexual dysfunction. And this is something that we miss to inquire and treat. So it's important to actually approach this as a case of drug-induced hypogonadism. You can liaise with other teams if necessary, and also perhaps look at what other things might be contributing to it. Some of the risk factors for this is age, the dose of the opioid, the duration of exposure, and whether there was previous sexual dysfunction. Now, a lot of centers up north and even some centers across India use something called detox-only. Detox-only means that if a person presents to them in withdrawal, they basically give a very high dose of buprenorphine on day one, and then they rapidly down titrate that, maybe 5 to 7 days, and then send the patient home. So there's no maintenance, it's just detox. Now, the thing is, I think the reason why this is popular is because a lot of these centers may not have very large stocks of buprenorphine, or they may not have the other practical things that you need for take home dosing or long term care, etc. They may not have urine quantification, right? They may not have a stock registry, etc., etc., or the patient may not be able to afford it long term. And having said that, and I know that it's practical in many scenarios, detox only in research has been shown to be an inadequate treatment, and in some cases may also be harmful. So it should be considered really carefully. It actually increases the risk of overdose mortality acutely, as per some of the research done outside. So it's very important that even if you have to consider a detox only scenario, make sure that we educate them about overdose and also inform them about the option of maintenance therapy and link them with other psychosocial supports, maybe other medications. If buprenorphine is not an option, then looking at other, ancillary agents which can help with craving moving forward. Because just doing a detox will abate the withdrawal symptoms, but may not take care of the craving at all. If you're planning on reducing the buprenorphine in your termination stage, the guidelines for practitioners gives this kind of a chart, wherein if someone is on a very high dose, then we reduce by 4 mg every 1 to 2 weeks. Whereas if someone is on a lower dose, like below 2 mg, then we go zero point 0.4 to 0.8 mg every 1 to 2 weeks. As you can see in every column, in every row, they've actually talked about how it's 1 to 2 weeks, right? And there are very short, small titrations that we're doing. In practical scenarios, I have found this to be much longer sometimes because patients can have insomnia, they can have they can have body pain, and because of that, we might have to add other agents from time to time, take it slow on in certain months, go faster in certain months. So it's honestly very, very collaborative, and it can take more than a few months to actually bring it down, especially if it's at a very high dose. If by chance you want to shift from buprenorphine to naltrexone, then buprenorphine and naltrexone should have a good gap. So let's say that on day one, this patient is admitted, and on day two, the person is currently on, say 8 mg. So what we want to do is actually give a gap of the buprenorphine, and then after that, we want to start off the naltrexone. We don't start off the naltrexone directly with 50 milligrams. We actually try and piece the tablet to make it 25 milligram, 12.5 milligram, 6 milligram, 3 milligram, if the only formulation available is 50. But then we also have doses which are below that, so then it'll be easier to do. This is preferably in an IP setting so that you can look for precipitated withdrawal. And what's actually recommended is doing also a naloxone challenge test. And naloxone, being a short-acting opioid, can help you actually ascertain if there is any risk of withdrawal or not before considering naltrexone. Right? You can also give other supportive medication in the meanwhile to support them with sleep, with restlessness, and things like that. What I would like to, say, which is apart from buprenorphine, is that substituting weaker agonists like tramadol and tapentadol might require a very different dosing strategy. You might start low and go slow, much slower than heroin. You might have to actually look at tolerability, because maybe the cross tolerance between buprenorphine and say tapentadol, which we see a lot in our center, may not be as perfect as heroin. It's also important to note that there are clinically no significant drug interactions between buprenorphine and medications used for HIV, Hep C, and TB. So it's important that when we give a package of interventions like is suggested by NACO, we also make sure that we routinely test for these other illnesses and then treat them as well. And it should not affect the buprenorphine maintenance therapy. Finally, I want to talk about practical considerations. When we're looking at buprenorphine dispensation as a private practitioner or maybe in a clinic, earlier, I think pre 2018, there was a clause that actually said that buprenorphine can only be dispensed by a de-addiction center. But then, because the Psychiatric Association said that because of this clause, the availability of buprenorphine is quite limited across the country, they've kind of changed that. And now a psychiatrist can apply for a license. So if you were to apply for a license, then this is kind of an operational checklist. This is not foolproof, and nor is it, that every item should be met. But these are some things to consider. One is to confirm the state rules and regulations, because it might change from state to state. For example, in Punjab, you can also look into registration and discuss with your state nodal officer for HIV and NACO OST programs if you want to link it with these national programs. You have to secure a licensed supplier and maintain your invoices. Also, maybe it'll be a good idea to prepare an SOP for how you induct, how you stabilize, how many days of take home doses do you allow, how do you, manage missed doses, how do you handle diversion, etc. This SOP can be drawn from the NACO guideline document itself. You also have to maybe look at secure storage, inventory logbook, and dispensing register, how many tablets each person is taking. This might be important considering the other legal aspects around buprenorphine dispensation. The other things you might have handy are consent forms and cow scale forms. And typically, a psychiatrist does all of it, the induction, the maintenance, the termination. But if you have a facility wherein a nurse or a medical officer can supervise the administered doses, then that might be helpful as well. And then links for psychosocial support. So it's important to have maybe a psychologist or a social worker who can link these interventions with other psychosocial strategies to kind of look at opioid dependence as a whole and not just looking at buprenorphine maintenance itself. Also, if you're worried about the risk of misuse, which is something that a lot of practitioners are a bit worried about, then one option is to use buprenorphine-naloxone preparations wherever possible. There are some limitations to this, because the buprenorphine-naloxone preparations are much more costly than the plain buprenorphine, and also availability might be an issue in some areas, right? The other thing we can do is observe dosing, like I mentioned, limit the take-home dosing. So in all of the documents, they've looked at 7 days, but then in special situations, 14 days or 100 tablets, whichever is lesser. There are some exceptions to this, of course. And like I said, every OST center can have their own SOP with that regard. We are a much larger OST center, so our SOP might differ slightly. But then overall, what we're looking at is, making sure that the take-home dosing is fairly limited. Also looking at patient contracts and what you can do. This is something that we need to start talking about as soon as we think about induction. Then monitoring, if urine monitoring is possible at your center, then that's perfect. If not, then we'll also have to look at, other reports, corroboratory evidence from family members, etc. And also another way to reduce misuse is to actually engage them in meaningful work and other community support systems. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation.